Just by way of information, because we know there are always more students interested in international careers than we have time or speakers to present on. We are recording today's lecture, so even though it's a smaller group, I'm going to ask Ian to stay at the podium and for our recording and podcasting audience. Foreign Service Student Organization is one of the 13 Kennedy Center student organizations. A lot of times, I think people have different ideas of why we have student organizations, and from time to time when they have to jump through all the hoops of getting accredited and figuring out budgets and dealing with, what little bureaucracy we do have, but it is a bureaucracy here. I'm sure they ask the same question. But for many, many years, going back to even Professor Stan Taylor, our founding director's time at the Kennedy Center, we've had student groups. They serve a valuable purpose in enriching the educational experience and giving students a chance to lead on a variety of issues, and also developing networks and connections. We have 1,000 students at the Kennedy Center. There are over 1,700 BYU students who go on study abroad each year, and I gather that many of those students haven't met each other yet. Those people who find their way to the Kennedy Center tend to be among the most internationally interested and sometimes connected, but not always. And so the Kennedy Center is a place to benefit all of campus. And our student organizations are a great way to do that. You don't have to be a major in the Kennedy Center. You don't have to have done an internship or a study abroad, although we hope every one of you will. You just have to have interest. And I could go on and on with stories of students who have gone on to very interesting professional and personal experiences as a result of the associations they made. So there's lots of different ways that you can connect across campus, but we hope that you'll consider these student organizations. Today, the two that I would point you to in addition to FSSO is the Students for International Development Group, which hosts the Hunger Banquet on campus, which just recently happened a few weeks ago. I see Macy here. And stand up, Macy. If you're interested, Macy's one to talk to about SID. I think they have the largest Facebook group of any of our student organizations, over 900 followers. They have weekly meetings and are very active if you're interested in development. Obviously, many of you are here because you're interested in diplomacy, and as you know, we have a rich legacy of both BYU graduates as well as Latter-day Saints in the Foreign Service, in the Civil Service, in specialist positions. I like to remind everyone there are 4 BYU graduates currently serving in ambassadorial posts, 3 of whom went through our Middle East Studies Arabic program, and one of whom, Ambassador Robert King, is a political science graduate who is the special representative to North Korea based in Washington for human rights. So there we have a rich tradition starting with Ambassador David Kennedy for interest in the Foreign Service. Today's speaker, as I mentioned, Mr. Houston is the Executive Director of the American Foreign Service Association, and as such, he represents the Foreign Service in many different capacities, but in a different way than many of our Foreign Service speakers come. So we're really excited to have him come and share his perspectives on that. In addition to that, he is a kind of a Washington insider, which we say that with all love and esteem. We have many graduates and alumni working in Washington inside the Beltway, and that's a very important and exciting career path. And so for many of you who may have had the opportunity to do Washington seminar or perhaps to participate in Beyond BYU, or perhaps you're just kind of exploring ideas and looking toward what comes next, we believe that Ian's perspectives, I think, will be very helpful and insightful in helping you understand a little bit more about the world of diplomacy, the world of development, and the world of careers in Washington, D.C. Ian's a graduate of BYU, bachelor's and master's degrees. He also attended the University of Kent, where he received master's degree as well. He's received numerous honors. He was a Truman Scholar, and the list goes on and on. You can review his bio. It's been a long time coming. We've been excited for this day, so look forward to hearing Ian Houston speaking on representing the U.S. Foreign Service and international NGOs, practical knowledge, and career management. Please join me in welcoming Ian Houston.
Well, thank you very much, Corey. This is truly an honor. This I have to say, as far as diplomacy goes, the manner in which the faculty, the administration, the students have welcomed me, that is diplomacy at its best. These are some of the brightest people and I'm most grateful for the welcome that you've extended to me, quite a gracious welcome. I do thank Brigham Young University, which I consider one of the finest universities in the world, for a unique and enriching experience, and certainly congratulate the David M. Kennedy Center for the terrific work that it continues to do in forging unique programs and unique opportunities for a unique group of students. I'm very impressed, continue to be impressed by the church educational system overall. The church educational system, so you know, is basically serving about 1.2 million people in the world in 144 countries. It's extraordinary that what the CES is doing in touching lives and inspiring people. Let us remind ourselves that this unique opportunity that we have to have an education is something most of the world does not have. This is a rich opportunity that we have, and a great blessing that we are surrounded by such a great institution and people who are leading the David M. Kennedy Center, and Jeff Ringer and Corey Lee Leonard. I also would like to recognize the Foreign Service Student Organization, which I think it might be the 15th anniversary that you're celebrating this year, although we haven't confirmed that, but nevertheless an organization that does have a long tradition. And it's great to see it, that it keeps going. So congratulations to the officers for moving it forward. I do wish to express personal appreciation to a mentor of mine who's in the audience. Corey mentioned Professor Stan Taylor. Stan Taylor for me was a mentor, sometimes up close, sometimes from a distance, but nevertheless a person, an individual who inspired me, and a person who really shaped those formative years. And I am most grateful to him, and will always treasure my experience being here and being taught by him. Thank you, Professor Taylor. There was another professor I spoke to this morning named Louis Midgley, and he is a person that many of you will not know. Some of you do know him and remember him. I remember one very interesting story. I find myself on this side of the lectern, and I've done this before, but not at BYU. I've been on this side of the lectern many times, but not at BYU. Interesting story about Louis Midgley. He was a political science professor. I had a specialty in philosophy and metaphysics, and I had been taking a course from him. He had been speaking about Aristotle and the idea of oak tree and acorns, and this is something that in metaphysics that Aristotle had referred to. I'm not saying that I remember the philosophical points that Aristotle was making, but what I did before his next lecture, I went out and collected a couple of acorns, and I put them on the lectern. I told him this morning. I put them on the lectern for him to remind him of what he had just spoken about. And he came to the podium and he took those acorns and he threw them across the room, and they hit the back of the room, very much in keeping with his personality. A little bit unpredictable, but nevertheless a person that had a great influence on me, and I certainly recognize him. There's something special about a university, the atmosphere that it provides, the liberty and the freedom that exists in a university setting, the search for innovation that is apparent in the air. A university should be a place of light, of liberty, and of learning, said British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. And this defines this university. The Kennedy Center is truly making a difference. Today, as Corey mentioned, what I'd like to focus in on is my experience representing the United States Foreign Service, but also representing NGOs, the international realm of doing humanitarian work, and give you a couple of practical suggestions that might inform your careers or inform your study, and perhaps even inform the curriculum here at the Kennedy Center or even beyond. Allow me to make a foundational point, and one that I alluded to perhaps earlier. emulate the characters that you're interacting with. The characters of people, your professors, the people that you're hearing from, you're reading about. It may be the people that you're experiencing in your literature courses, characters that are coming off the pages, people that resonate with you. Keep an educational experience that is wide-ranging. Try not to get too focused on just one piece of your education, but keep a wide lens. And from my experience, truly try to emulate those characters. Emulate the characters in history that have a real interest for you, but also emulate the characters in your own families. Read their histories. Deepen compassion for yourself and patience for yourself. And that will inform your path forward. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Do not go where the path may lead you. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail." So be ambitious. Dream big. Please do that. And I have been to places I could not even have imagined. Meeting presidents, meeting secretaries of state. Just this week, having conversations with Condoleezza Rice and George Shultz. I'm doing things that I could have never imagined. And I didn't even dream that big. But I encourage you to be ambitious and think big. I also would say here at the outset, again, more of a foundational point, is that we set out to make a difference, and that is a noble and worthy goal. And I have no doubt, as I look over this audience, that many of you will achieve great things. There is no doubt in my mind that that will occur, that you will experience things that you will not even imagine. So for those who are here in this audience or those who are watching virtually, let me just encourage that you remember that you can make a difference in the world. But perhaps there is a deeper and valuable lesson. That what we learn and what I have learned is that the difference that truly is made is in ourselves, by the people who shape our lives, by the people who serve us, by the people who teach us, and the events themselves that shape our characters. If we understand this principle from my experience and through my career, we are more honest, we are more modest and humble, and we are more successful. We're more earnest in our desire to step forward and serve rather than seeking after things for blind ambition. Be ready for setbacks. Be ready to embrace them. Learn from them. Accept your weaknesses. I have many, and I have tried to develop them into strengths. But you will have setbacks. Again, as I say, embrace those setbacks. Welcome them. It's great to get that first job. I know it is. It's great to get that A on a paper, or great to get something published in a worthy publication. But I think we learn perhaps more about ourselves when we don't get that job, or we don't get that A perhaps, or we don't get that piece published in a worthy publication. So just be patient with yourself and be ready for setbacks and look at them as positive experiences versus negative ones. So knowledge is one of the great pursuits in life, and feast on it in terms of what has been afforded you. So let me sort of shift a little bit to the more practical realm after those foundational points. And I know some of you, of course, aspire to the Foreign Service, and that is a worthy goal. I want to speak to that point a little bit differently from what perhaps you have heard from other terrific Foreign Service representatives who have come through this university, or others that you have heard about online. my career has allowed me to represent the Foreign Service at the highest levels, as I say, with presidents and undersecretaries and foreign dignitaries. And that is something that I value. It requires that I know much about the Foreign Service, and you need to as well, as a career, make real decisions about what direction you may want to go. Say you may want to be a counselor officer, an economic officer, management officer, political officer, a public diplomacy officer. Really think about that sort of track. That's very important for you to do. But it's not for me here to counsel you on how to go about doing that, because there is so much online, and there are resources here at the Kennedy Center to help you with that decision. Allow me to make some practical suggestions from my standpoint. This is very important to me, and a key point that I would mention to you. Know U.S. diplomatic history. And by that, what I mean is really know the key moments that have occurred in our diplomatic history. How diplomacy has advanced the interests of the United States and created a more secure society. Know those events. Learn about the diplomacy during the Revolution, even during the Civil War. Know about that rich period that occurred related to diplomacy after the First War, and then that very fascinating period that occurred right after the Second War. What diplomacy, what was happening, what the practitioners were doing in the diplomatic realm. Of course, there are other events later in the 20th century, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Cold War itself, the dissolution of the Soviet Union and how that changed Eastern Europe, et cetera, and how that changed the world. Nuclear disarmament, negotiations that were occurring around those subjects. Know diplomatic history. And allow me to help you to do that, and perhaps even the Kennedy Center to give some advice. There is a program through an organization called ADST. ADST has an oral history program. And through that oral history program, you are able to access oral histories that are quite extensive with diplomats, practitioners who have actually encountered these events. Not the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, but more 20th century events and some events that have occurred in recent years. So for me, what I have found is I learn the diplomatic event, know diplomatic history, but then I also learn about the characters, the actors themselves. You really need to know the people who are the actors in the Foreign Service. For me, I've had the opportunity to really get to know, as personal friends, people like Ambassador Roz Ridgway, who, this being Women's History Month, is one of the greatest Foreign Service officers of the 20th century, in my view. Now, many of you may not have known who Roz Ridgway is, and maybe that's the first time you're hearing her name. But nevertheless, she was a highly professional officer who devoted herself to her country. Then you have people like Bruce Langan, who was the most senior hostage in the Iranian crisis, taken hostage in 1979, released in 1981. A Foreign Service officer, Ambassador John Limbert, who was also there in Iran, held hostage. Tom Pickering, who I believe has been an ambassador perhaps 6 times through his career, Foreign Service officer, a person that I have gotten to know. Ron Newman, Ambassador Bill Burns, Michael Guest, Ambassador Tom Boyott, Ambassador Andrew Winter, Ruth Davis, who was the first African-American woman appointed Director General of the Foreign Service, and a real tribute to the profession in terms of how she's conducted her career. Ladies and gentlemen, these are true professionals, and that's how you have to view these individuals. And what has helped me in my respect in representing both the diplomatic career, but the individuals themselves, and having respect, almost as one would have respect if you had an individual who had served at D-Day and walked through those doors. That's the sort of respect these diplomats have earned in terms of what they have sacrificed for this country. And I think that will help you to appreciate the career even more. And if you're conversant on diplomatic history and you're conversant on the individuals and their experiences, that will help you going forward should you want to take the Foreign Service exam, et cetera. So for me, I can't tell you how poignant some of these stories are related to the Foreign Service. Do you know that actually during the Iran hostage crisis, when Bruce Langan was taken hostage in 1979, his wife, Penny Langan, who I am friends with, she went outside after hearing the news, and she took a yellow ribbon and she tied it around a tree in front of their Bethesda home. And after that, there were people in the community in Bethesda in Maryland, then Virginia, and then it started to spread across the country and then around the world. And it was from that very poignant moment that Penny Langan just took that yellow ribbon and tied it around that tree in honor of her husband. The origin of the yellow ribbon, in a modern sense, comes from that Foreign Service experience. That actual ribbon is in the Library of Congress. And so remember that, know that history, that tribute and what was happening in our culture during those years was quite significant, and it related to diplomacy in the Foreign Service. So use that as a vehicle for understanding perhaps a profession that you may wish to pursue. My other piece of advice would be to know the legislative history of the Foreign Service. And by that I mean, let me take you back to 1924. A piece of legislation named the Rogers Act merged the diplomatic and consular services of the United States government 90 years ago. That created the modern Foreign Service. So the modern Foreign Service is 90 years old this year. Know that. Know the legislative history. Be conversant with it. 1946, following the war, there was an additional piece of legislation that advanced additional reforms in the personnel management system. A significant piece of legislation was the 1980 Foreign Service Act. And this could be potentially a paper that you write, could be a senior paper, it could be a subject that you focus in on because it's a rich piece of legislation. The bottom line is that you should be conversant on what the Foreign Service Act said and what it was attempting to do. The Foreign Service Act of 1980 abolished the Foreign Service Reserve category of officers, reformed the personnel system for non-diplomatic locally employed staff or the Foreign Service nationals. It created a senior Foreign Service with a rank structure equivalent to generals and flag officers in the armed forces. And so it did things like enacted danger pay for diplomats who serve in dangerous and hostile environments, along with many other administrative changes. So 1980 is a long time ago. 1980 is when the U.S. hockey team beat the Soviet Union in Lake Placid. A long time ago. And so therefore, it's quite possible that there will be additional pieces of legislation that come forward related to the Foreign Service. But understand the legislative history, because that will help inform you going forward. And I encourage perhaps there even be modules on that subject and even papers on that. That will be very useful to you. So that's a recommendation I have. Then I would say, know the American Foreign Service Association, which I represent, along with many of my colleagues. What is this thing we call AFSA? What is it? Well, the American Foreign Service Association is the professional association of the United States Foreign Service, formed in 1924, in the same year that the modern Foreign Service was created. So an organization that goes back 90 years, and I'm privileged to be the executive director of an organization that has such a rich history. In 1973, AFSA was certified as the exclusive employee representative of the Foreign Service, the bargaining unit of the Department of State and USAID. Also, the United States Information Agency. In 1994, AFSA actually was certified as the exclusive representative for the Foreign Service bargaining units of the Foreign Agricultural Service and the Foreign Commercial Service. Know that. AFSA basically has the legal right to negotiate with management regarding changes in conditions of employment related to the bargaining unit employees. It's basically the exclusive employee representative, as I say, of the Foreign Service. As an organization, we have about 16,200 members. We've grown quite a bit over the last few years. We have an elected board comprised of both active duty Foreign Service, but also retirees. The chair of the board, or the current president of the organization, is a person named Bob Silverman. Then the state vice president, a person named Matthew Asada, both active duty. But then we have a rich composition of board members, 28 board members, if you can believe it, who offer their time and talents to help the organization go forward as board members. We have a staff of communications experts, of legal experts who get into grievances associated with Foreign Service life and employment. We have what we call the Foreign Service Journal. Has everyone seen the Foreign Service Journal? Okay. The Foreign Service Journal is an AFSA publication, goes back actually before AFSA was even an organization, back to 1918. We put a variety of articles in the Foreign Service Journal. We produce books such as Inside a U.S. Embassy that Corey and I have talked about. Inside a U.S. Embassy is, if you have not read that book, please read that book. That is a window into how an embassy functions. And I suspect some of your professors are actually using it as a book for your courses. If not, suggest it to your professors, because Inside a U.S. Embassy is a terrific book to help inform you. Here's one interesting thing I want to raise about AFSA. We give an actual award that we call Constructive Dissent. We give a lifetime award for diplomacy, some performance awards, but we also give an award for constructive dissent. Now, for those who may not be so familiar with the word dissent in America's lexicon or our history, the word itself is a very respected word. I think it's taken on perhaps a different meaning as the years have gone by. But constructive dissent, the idea of dissent, perhaps is the highest form of professionalism. In other words, when, in the case of the Foreign Service, when someone sees policy that is not headed in the right direction or maybe damaging to the interests of the United States or the interests of the United States within the country, that the Foreign Service professional has an obligation to perhaps offer constructive dissent. So as an organization, AFSA has prided itself on giving cash awards in a very public ceremony, sometimes with the Secretary of State. If not the Secretary, it will be the Deputy Secretary, in giving an award for constructive dissent on specific policy issues. So, as I say, the individuals that I've mentioned earlier are individuals that so appreciate the fact that they are a part of a profession, that they believe so strongly in the ethical code of being a Foreign Service representative, that they're willing to challenge the system if they feel the system is somehow not meeting the interests of the United States. That can be a hard thing to do. It's especially, you think about it through the lens of being students, that's a hard thing to do. but it's in my view the highest form of professionalism, and so therefore we offer awards for these sorts of activities. And it's extraordinary what some of these folks have done. Some have lost their careers, but they have done that because they are professionals. And I want you to just appreciate that AFSA is the professional association of the Foreign Service to preserve the integrity of the Foreign Service profession. And for people to really understand that that is real. Understand what's important to the Foreign Service: pay issues, training needs, capacity. You realize the Foreign Service is only 15,000 people? That's it. You think about how different the climate of the world has changed within the last 10 years. And while the Foreign Service has grown, the obligations of the political climate, certainly coming from members of Congress and others, the requirements are that much greater. Is 15,000 large enough? I'll let you make that conclusion. From my standpoint, no, it is not. And so the AFSA has addressed issues of capacity, growing the Foreign Service, and then mitigating danger at post. And those, in some cases, are quite significant. Americans, patriots, Foreign Service officers who are in great danger, and they need to be protected to do their jobs. So no AFSA. Allow me to shift a little bit to the international NGO realm, which has been an area that I have spent a lot of my career in. International NGOs, if you think of the industry itself, the collection of all these entities has truly exploded within the last 20 years. The amount of NGOs, perhaps even in Utah, but even throughout the United States and around the world, doing highly specialized activities has grown considerably. And I know you're aware of that. Some of you here may have interest in getting into subjects such as humanitarian work or development, and that's great. Encourage you to do that. But let me ask this of you, is as you set out down that road, please consider that there are real practical skills that you need to develop. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about some of the subjects that are important, that are great here at the Kennedy Center, such as the economic subjects that are covered. I'm talking about real business skills as you think about international development. It's not just understanding what development is or what the humanitarian interest might be in a certain country. It's really understanding how an NGO functions. You really need to spend time in developing management skills, skills of strategic planning, governance, how to interact with a board, how to manage a staff. So very practical skills. And you should also know, I was mentioning at lunch with some colleagues, that international NGO work is a business. The goals ultimately, of course, are extremely worthy and valuable, especially to alleviate suffering and poverty. But also remember that it is a business. You need to understand how do contracts work. Say if you are ending up working for an NGO, do you know how to approach USAID for a proposal for a contract? You should take time to learn how to do that. And again, there could be potential modules that could be developed in terms of providing practical skills training for students as they wish to enter those careers. Then I would say quickly here, and I want to be mindful of the time, I would encourage you, again, it could be through a paper that you submit in one of your courses. It could be a module here at the Kennedy Center or even a course in and of itself. Know the international affairs budget. know the components, what comprises the budget, know how one influences the process. Because if you do that, you are that much more skilled and that much more conversant in terms of how Washington works and how budgets may operate in different countries. Really take time to learn that international affairs budget. We call it the Function 150 account. It is just 1% of the overall federal budget, a little bit more than that. But know what it does, how it works, how it's developed, what in any given administration are the goals and interests of that budget. But really try to spend some time learning that process. And then even posing the questions through debate, whether or not the $50 billion that the United States spends for the 150 account is enough to advance our interests globally. You know, be a vehicle for, should you wish to advance change, move that debate forward and engage with organizations that are at the forefront of that debate. So I would encourage you to get to know that budget. A last couple of points here. I mentioned certainly that I've been in Washington for a long time. I would say to you in sort of a candid way, as a person who has experienced the ways of Washington, is that you avoid the trap, there's a trap, of blind political partisanship. And by that I mean, certainly we live in a partisan system. But don't be overly zealous, is my recommendation, in a modest way. It's for you to make your own decisions, but don't be overly zealous as you desire to serve in international capacities in being too engaged in blind political partisanship. Try to really learn, and I think you are doing this, understand another point of view. Learn to find and till and nurture common ground. This is very important to me and something that I've learned. A common ground should not be this uncommonly desolate and barren place that so many have characterized it to be. A place that is convictionless. Quite the contrary. Common ground is the place, is something that we need to restore as a society in the foreign policy arena, in politics generally. And that is where we find solutions. That is where, to carry that analogy a little further, that we find that garden spot, that place where diverse ideas can take root in rich soil and where problems can be solved. And that's what we need. And you can be vehicles for finding that common ground. Now I'll end with this story. And I haven't spoken about this publicly, but I end in this story because I want to use it as a way to help you as you think about your careers and your studies. A little over a year ago, my father passed away, someone who I was very close with, an individual who came from Glasgow, Scotland. In fact, I'm wearing his school tie in honor of him. He passed away about, as I say, a little over a year ago. I had spent much of my time with him in his last few weeks. He was still very conversant. I had to leave, and I said goodbye to him, and I came back to Washington. And literally hours after I arrived home, my mother called me and said that he had passed away. And the next day, I was scheduled and obligated to go to a funeral for Senator Daniel Inouye, one of the great senators who had served with my uncle in the 442nd during the Second War. So I went to this funeral, and I sat with Elizabeth Dole. And I sat down, and I told her my father just died a few hours ago. And she was most kind and gracious. After the ceremony concluded, I left it was held at the National Cathedral. I left the cathedral with the others who were leaving. And then I decided I would go back and I would express my appreciation to President Clinton, who had been speaking, but mostly to say a prayer. He was there only with a couple of people in the back. And so I approached the president, and as I approached him, the people sort of moved away. It was the two of us in the nation's cathedral, and I was speaking to the president, and I expressed to him my appreciation for his words and how I appreciated that, what he had said. And I told him that my father had just passed away, and he held my hands, and he talked to me about my dad. And I talked to him about my uncle as well, who had been with Daniel Inouye. The reason I tell you that story is that I was in the nation's cathedral, and I found myself only hours after my own father had passed away speaking with an admired president. I could have talked about a lot of different things, but what came to me is my father. And my conversation with the president was about a family member. So my last piece of advice to you is embrace this rich culture that you have, the world that is around you. Build on the knowledge that you have an opportunity to build upon, and seize this opportunity, seize this moment that you have, because I can assure you it's such a short moment in your lives, but really try to seize it and be patient. But as you build that knowledge, I have learned that we build our knowledge most importantly of worldly things, of foreign affairs, of international NGOs, of management, of the Foreign Service, of diplomacy itself. That is great to build that knowledge, but we must build it upon a faith in God. Whatever one's faith may be, build your knowledge of worldly things upon a knowledge of God. And that's what I have learned in my career. And that has been the foundation of my career. So with that, I leave it open to questions. Corey.
So we'll just have you come over to the mic. We've got a standing mic. Tell us your name. Tell us, ask your question, and we've got about 5 minutes left, so please go ahead.
Afternoon. My name is Aaron Haynes. Last fall, I had the opportunity to intern at the embassy in Rome during the government shutdown. And so I was just wondering, I know at the embassy things were very tense and kind of on edge, and I was wondering what the atmosphere was like in DC, in your office, and what kind of things that you were doing during that time for the Foreign Service.
Well, diplomats are ready to work. They're just ready to do the work of diplomacy. And unfortunately, that situation of the budget, again, was not worked out in the way that it should have. But diplomats are just simply ready to do the work. And that is a good illustration of what potentially a budget discussion, how it can potentially harm the interests of the United States, in this case overseas, if a budget agreement is not forged. The AFSA was very much involved in bringing people together to voice our views about why we felt that the budget needed to be solved, and that diplomats essentially were ready to work and patriotic and willing and ready to serve. So we did not in any way go a negative route. We used it as a vehicle to emphasize the positive work that embassies such as in Rome, the work that is done overseas. And if you shut down the government for any long period of time, what sort of services are compromised? So we use it as a positive way to educate people about the Foreign Service and what the Foreign Service does. And overall, I'm glad they finally worked out that agreement. And hopefully Congress will learn that that's a key function that it plays, is to provide appropriations to the federal government and do it in a timely fashion.
Hi, I'm Sam Dearden, and there's been a lot of talk, especially on the Yahoo groups for the oral examination for the Foreign Service, about a hiring freeze. And what do you project in terms of the hiring freeze, and how long would you think it would last? And kind of long term, where do you see the budget of the Foreign Service?
Well, there had been a real surge in the Foreign Service over the last...
since 2001.
Exactly. So there are a lot of people who were hired, both at state and USAID. So a lot of officers and specialists, et cetera, came into the Foreign Service. So there was a real growth. The budget right now is not there. It's not supporting the growth that I feel that we need. And in my view, we just simply need a larger Foreign Service. But we also need a Foreign Service who is properly trained. And so AFSA as an organization really emphasizes the need for training longer term to train our professionals.
Do you see that changing anytime soon?
Well, the budget climate right now is not very good.
Right.
So right now, the president's current budget request is not, again, it's a tough budget climate, so the fact that he's able to keep it even at the same level or a little bit more is a good thing. That's positive. But it does not lay out a plan to raise the numbers overall in the Foreign Service. So that is an issue that General Powell, Secretary Powell, was very focused in on. Condoleezza Rice was, Secretary Clinton was, growing the capacity of the Foreign Service. There's a good organization called AAD. You should look them up. They've done a couple of studies on the need for growth in the Foreign Service. They did a publication a few years ago. You should be able to find that on their website, AAD.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
My name is Amy Prentice, and I'm in law school. I'm wondering what kind of opportunities, I know there's an arm of the State Department that is involved with religious freedom. I'm wondering what kind of opportunities there are, how a person gets involved in that, works their way in, what kind of opportunities there are there.
Okay. Specifically on international religious freedom.
Yeah, the Department of...
Well, this is an area of real growth as well, religious tolerance, et cetera, and how religion itself factors into foreign policy. So it's grown a lot at the State Department, the individuals who are committed to it. There are also outside organizations that get involved. Certainly approaching those entities is a more traditional route. But as I say, there are a lot of NGOs, non-government organizations that are focused in on the issue of religious tolerance and religious freedom, et cetera, who are employing attorneys to engage these debates. So again, a traditional route, of course, is to gravitate to the larger entities that are more traditionally in the news. But think about that layer of the NGOs that are offering their services in a more narrow sense to address the issue. And there are many of them. I mean, just do a search and you'll find many of them. And if you didn't want to be in Washington, they are certainly all over the world. So.
Is there, like, the State Department's actual, I can't remember what it's called offhand, but is there any kind of pathway through the State Department, in the State Department's religious freedom realm, that you would follow?
Well, it's a good question. The State Department, of course, has basically 50,000 employees, so it's a large bureaucracy, if that's okay to say. I don't mean that in any derogatory way, but so it's hard to give you like a specific. Maybe what we could do is talk afterwards, and I could give you a couple of names of people to talk with.
Okay, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yep.
Just in follow-up to the previous question, how do you feel the State Department is doing in improving training for their officers in relation to their understanding of religion and how that affects the creation of policy in heavily religious countries? The
Foreign Service Institute, FSI, named after George Shultz, is doing very innovative work in terms of training officers and coming up with a curriculum that is allowing not just for language training, but training along the lines of what you're talking about. So the leadership of FSI has, new leadership, it's just come in within the last year, has been looking for ways to do just that, to train individuals to be more sensitive, to be more understanding, both in language, cultural. So FSI has been the vehicle. It's truly like a college campus. When you're out in Washington, you probably could get an opportunity to walk around FSI. That's very useful. It could be through Washington Seminar. I'm sure I would be happy to try to arrange that for the students who are out there to tour the campus at FSI. But that's been the vehicle for the training. But there is, of course, the budget side of it as well, just having enough capacity in the budget to train people in the appropriate way.
Thank you.
Yep.